you, Steve. We're beginning a new sermon series on godly living, and it's looking at a variety of different ways that we can actually do some things that will draw us closer in our relationship with God, closer in our relationships with one another, and hopefully make the world around us a better place. Now, I'm just going to make the general assumption that you would not be here this morning if you weren't serious about doing what the Bible says that you ought to do. And so you should already be considering what you're going to do about what we read this morning together and what was emphasized in the children's sermon, and which ended from that Deuteronomy chapter 6 verses 4 through 9 with these particular, what we might think of sort of strange directions. And you shall bind them as symbols on your hand and on your foreheads, and you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. One of the things that the people Moses led decided to do in response to these particular words was to nail a small piece of parchment that had been rolled up and inserted into a container. Those containers sometimes made out of wood, out of metal, out of stone, out of ceramic, and then they take that container and they nail it onto their doorposts at their house. It's called a Mezuzah, which I know this is going to be a great theological insight. The Hebrew word for Mezuzah means doorpost. That's all it means. It can be rather artistic, it can be rather plain. They write on this parchment the 22 lines of the Shema, which are not only included in what we read this morning, Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9, but also in Deuteronomy 11, verses 13 through 21. Altogether, it makes the Shema. And I'm going to read those to you now because you probably are not as familiar with that second part of the Shema. I'm not going to have the words projected this morning because we're supposed to hear them. And so I want you to focus on hearing them. Moses said, and he was speaking for the Lord, "It shall come about, if you listen obediently to my commandments, which I am commanding you today, to love the Lord your God and to serve him with all your heart and all your soul, that he will give the rain for your land in its season, the early and the late rain, that you may gather in your grain and your new wine and your oil. He will give grass in your fields for your cattle, and you will eat and be satisfied. Beware that your hearts are not deceived, and that you do not turn away and serve other gods and worship them, or the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will shut up the heavens so that there will be no rain, the ground will not yield its fruit, and you will perish quickly from the good land that the Lord is giving to you. You shall therefore impress these words of mine on your heart and on your soul, and you shall bind them as a sign on your hand and shall be as frontals on your forehead. You shall teach them to your sons, talking of them when you sit in your house and when you walk along the road and when you lie down and when you rise up. You will write them." Hopefully I'm reading to you. "You will write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates, so that your days and the days of your sons may be multiplied on the land which the Lord swore to your forefathers to give them as long as the heavens above remain." As I said, these verses are called the Shema, because Shema is the first word in the verse 4 of chapter 6. It is a Hebrew word. Shema is their Hebrew word for hear. It starts out, "Hear, O Israel." But you might not realize that their word to hear was also their word to obey. They didn't have two separate words. They only had one. And they believed that if you heard, you would obey. And so if you were not obeying, it's because you weren't hearing. You couldn't have one without the other in their understanding of things. Moses, as recorded in chapter 5, which we didn't read together, had just reminded the people of the 10 Commandments. I'm sure you're familiar with the 10 Commandments. If not, just go to chapter 5 and just read over them. These are the commandments that God had given to Moses when he was on Mount Sinai, and he had reminded them how their forefathers had committed to following them, those who had come out of Egypt. And in this commitment, they were making the same commitment as they were getting ready to move into the new land that we would refer to as the Promised Land, or to Israel. And they were committing themselves to do the same thing that their parents had done. Well, the Shema sums up the 10 Commandments as, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might, and serve him with all of your heart and soul. We would add, as did Jesus, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself, which is implied in those words but not expressly stated. God must have known that his people needed visual reminders of their commitment to love him. Reminders that would help keep them from being deceived by those who do not love God, nor desire to serve him, or by people who are really serving other gods in their lives. So their decision was to place one of these mezuzahs on their doorpost as a sign, not to remind what others might believe, not as a witness wear kind of thing, but as a reminder to themselves. They weren't trying to make a public declaration of their faith to the unbelieving world. It was a sign to remind themselves of their own commitment. I'd heard of mezuzahs before I got to take that trip to Israel several years ago, but I'd never actually seen one used. I didn't actually realize that they were still an important thing for Jewish families to do, but in Israel, I noticed on every doorpost of every room in every hotel that we stayed at, there was a mezuzah. It wasn't there for tourists. They stuck them there on purpose because they were following this law. I had noticed that when they stuck them on, they stuck them at a 45-degree angle with the top leaning toward the inside of the room. And so I asked our host, well, why are they mounted that way? They're all mounted kind of exactly the same. Is there some meaning behind this? And he's like, oh yeah, there's always a meaning, right? And so he told me the story about this great rabbi who felt that the door, these mezuzahs needed to be attached in a horizontal position, but he had this brilliant student who felt that they should be mounted in a vertical position. It just happened to be his brilliant student was also his grandson, and they had this huge generational dispute over which way you ought to hang your mezuzah. They didn't argue about the fact that they needed to be reminded, just how they were going to put up this reminder. They ended up with a 45-degree angle as a compromise, just in case you're wondering. Door after door, I saw them. And then in shop after shop, I noticed that they were being sold. When you bought them empty, and then you had to go to the rabbi, and the rabbi would take this parchment, write out the 22 lines on it, put it in there, and then usually you would see this symbol on it, which was their Hebrew letter for S, which was for Shaddai, which is El Shaddai, God's name of God the defender of our house, and they would just mount these things. But it made me wonder, were they doing this because they were keeping the letter of the law, or were they doing it because they were trying to keep the spirit of the law? Now, I certainly understand why people need to be reminded. I understand why God inspired Moses to tell these ancient people, it's just a little easy to get caught up in the routines of the day and be so influenced by others, whether you realize it or not, that you end up moving away from your commitment, that you simply forget. And now let's be honest, advertising works. Advertisers would not be spending huge amounts of money on advertisings if it didn't influence us. Everyone does it. But because we are a lot more easily than we want to admit that we are influenced by advertising, we need to listen what God was telling us about the way he created us. He said, you guys are easily influenced. You see stuff. It really helps you remember stuff. And so we need to take seriously the idea about advertising to ourselves. Not advertising to others, we need to advertise to ourselves. We need signs that remind us of our commitment, just as we need traffic signs to remind us that following the traffic laws is better than everyone just driving the way they want to drive. I don't know about you, but you might have seen some of those traffic signs and you might have thought, well, that's the stupidest sign ever. Why would you ever do? That's not for me, that's for somebody. You know how we kind of get when we see those signs. Most of us, however, though, we really understand that it's best to stop whenever there are two streets that intersect one another. You know, they come like this. Probably a good idea to stop at those places. And even if there were no signs, more than likely we would probably stop at them because we don't want to get hit by cars and the like. And if there's one that goes by and it doesn't have to stop and you come up to one and it seems to be a busier one, you'd probably think it's a good idea to stop even if the sign wasn't there. But if the sign was there and every time you came up to that intersection there was really no one going, have you ever sat at one of those like it's the red light, there's no one there, why do I have to stay here and be stopped, it's stupid. Well, there are a lot of people who come up to those stop signs, no one's going by, and so they just go right on through it. And then pretty soon they keep going right on through. Pretty soon they have developed a habit of going through an intersection and not even thinking about it. I encountered someone who did that right near my house. I was going down the road. I didn't have a stop sign at the intersection, so I'm driving. I saw the car coming up, but I thought, hey, they're going to stop. And they didn't, and they T-boned me. And when I got out, the first thing the lady said was, I knew I should have stopped. And I was like, yeah, I think so too. But she had been so used to coming to that stop sign, no one ever being there. It was a stupid sign because no one was ever there, and she just started going through it. Whether we have a reminder or not, we're supposed to be following God's ways, whether they seem stupid to us or not. Moses made it clear that when we obey, we enjoy God's blessings, and when we don't, we're going to have those blessings withdrawn from us. And I read a book not too long ago called Historical Drift. It's an older book, but I found it interesting. The book documents how institutions over time drift from their founders' original design and purpose. And so there's always this effort to repurpose and redesign. So constancy is this tendency to drift, that the authors were able to identify certain processes and steps of drifting, and they've sort of created a science out of it. The institution that they were applying this science in examination to was the church. And they found some interesting dynamics, and what they found sort of caused an alarm for them. They found that even though the churches have a firm foundation in the scriptures, which are over 2,000 years old, and that most churches claim to use the Word of God as their foundation for faith and practice, many churches have drifted away from what it actually says. The Restoration movement, of which we are a part, was born out of the recognition that the church has drifted away, especially in regard to its practice of baptism and the Lord's Supper and what is presented as the plan of salvation. The movement sought to restore the church's practice in these areas by following the blueprint of the Bible, of saying, hey, here's the Bible, this is what we go back to, this is how we found our foundations, this is how we should be doing things today. It was their hope that this would bring unity to the church, or at least it would bring unity between those in the congregation who were trying to restore themselves to the standards or the patterns of the Bible. Seems reasonable. But a lot of churches see the drift not as a problem, but as progress. And instead of seeing a need to restore back to the original, they see a need to reinterpret the Bible in a way that affirms the drift is really what God wants us to do. They often use Bible words, but they don't really define them by the Bible itself. And so they sound right, but they don't end up living right. Unfortunately, a lot more often than we want to admit it, God's people end up drifting away in their behaviors from their commitment to follow and serve God. They conveniently forget that they've made a commitment to the Lord and to live His way and follow His directions. But thankfully, God knew that we have a memory problem. Have you ever encountered people with a memory problem? We got whole wards of people with memory problems. I know it would be offensive, but every now and then I thought about putting a sign at the front of the church that says memory ward. You know, sometimes we have memory problems whenever it comes to our commitment to the Lord. And a memory problem leads to an obedience problem. And so He has asked us to sprinkle our lives with visible signs that we can use to remind ourselves about our commitments. We need reminders. I'm not talking about wearing witness wear. I like those t-shirts. They're fun. They're clever. Sometimes they're a little offensive in some ways. In fact, I saw one of them. You know, there's a lot of talk right now about LGBT and things like that. And we were trying to get small groups started in our church for a while. And they had a t-shirt that said LGBT on it. And I thought, man, I want one of those, because underneath it says Life Group Bible Teacher. And I thought, man, that'd be cool. You know, I could just get myself in a lot of trouble with that one. It's not to tell others what we're doing. A t-shirt would only be a mezuzah if we were wearing it to remind ourselves of what we're doing. We often use a cross or a fish, like a mezuzah. They usually get hung on walls or on chains around our necks. But we don't often lash them to our heads. I haven't seen that trend going on yet. We do put them in wall caps and put them on our head. Maybe that's about as close as we get. But we tend to use them as decorations, or we tend to use them as a way to display to others what our personal faith is, rather than using them as a personal reminder. Because, it's almost kind of offensive, isn't it, to say that you might have a memory problem. I mean, personal reminders are for people who just don't have it together. Personal reminder, that's for old people. That's not for people who are clear and sharp of mind. I mean, we would never forget something so as important as our commitment to Christ, right? I mean, we would never, ever really do that. We wouldn't drift from His ways. We would always be right on track. I'd like to say that we wouldn't, but the evidence leans that even the best of us tend to drift without any reminders in our lives. Because of this tendency noticed in my own life, I once got one of those small fish symbols that were designed to put on the back of your car. You know what I'm talking about? You've seen those kind of things? Knowing that this kind of stuff goes on, and personally goes on in my own life, I took that little fish and I put it on my rearview mirror. Because I figured that the only person that needs to be reminded that I'm a Christian is me. Because sometimes my driving habits, people would be hard-pressed to know that I was a Christian sometimes by my driving habits. And there are times that, driving up the front hills, it's going like, I better not turn into the church. People might think that I work there. Better just go, I'm going to go down and get a cup of coffee and come back later when it looks better. You know what I'm talking about. I sometimes have to admit that I need to be reminded of my commitment to be a person who honors and follows and loves God. And I especially need those commitments whenever that traffic is slowing down. There's only one car, but he's going 35, right? Reminding ourselves in such a public way is seen by others. And most important, those others who see it are our children. God commanded that we use their natural curiosity to share with them our commitment to love and serve the Lord. Not every now and then, not only on Sunday, but every day. When we get up and when we go about our business and we come back home, our children will learn whether we're just keeping the letter of the law or if we're following the spirit of the law as we follow Jesus. They will know whether we are sincere or whether we're just a bunch of hypocrites. Our children need to watch us as we make choices that are different than the other people around us because of our commitment to follow the Lord's ways. They need to experience the better way of life that results from remembering to remember to obey the Lord. But we're not just to teach them at home, although that needs to happen. We're not to just teach them at Sunday school when we gather together once a week or in our small groups, but that needs to happen. We are not to turn them over to the expert for someone else to do it. We are to teach our own children as we go about our daily routines. That's where they're really going to learn. They need to observe what we do, and believe me, they are going to observe, and when they observe, they're going to ask questions. They will want to know why we did X instead of Y. And then we'll have that opportunity to explain to them why we did X instead of Y, and they will learn how that's a better choice, and they will see this behavior happen over and over and over, and we will raise up children who, when faced with similar circumstances, will not only know how to respond, but why they're responding that way. To Mezuzah your universe is to build in extra reminders of your relationship with God in places where you need to be reminded. And you do. Would your TV viewing habits change if you stuck a cross or fish on the screen and you were reminded of your commitment to Christ? I mean, would your internet surfing habits change if you had a Mezuzah on your phone or on your computer screen? Would it change if you had one on your desktop? If you had one on the door of your office or your shop or your closet or wherever it is you get in trouble? Would what your hands do change if you bound one on your hand, like the scriptures say? Would your thinking change if you put on that ball cap? Yeah, I know. You can take this a little too far, right? And you can make a mezuzah a legalistic kind of thing. All right, you got your mezuzah on. If you don't have your mezuzah on, you're in trouble. The whole point of the mezuzahs was not to have the mezuzah. The whole point of the mezuzah was to remind you what God had commanded and to live his ways and your commitment to do so. Will your children ask why you got these reminders? Are you really that weak, Dad? You really got that terrible of a memory, Mom? And you need to say, yeah, God said I do. I agree with God. That's why I have those reminders there, because I want to do what's right. So you're going to talk to them about it. Will other people who see it ask those questions? Yeah, and it gives you that opportunity to explain why. You're not telling them they need to do it. You're just saying, hey, this is for me. I need it. That's why I'm doing this. We need reminders. You need reminders. I'm going to have the worship team come up to get ready for our last song. As they do, I want to tell you that one of the reasons that you need reminders is not only for yourself, but that scripture that Paul was talking about said, you know what? There are a lot of people out there in the world, and they're not going to read their Bibles. They probably don't even have a Bible. Even if the Gideons gave them a Bible, they probably said, oh, that's cool, thank you, and put it off somewhere. You know the Bible that they're going to read? You. They're going to know that you're a Christian. And they're going to be watching how you live your life and how you make your choices and the things that you do. They're going to see you reminding yourself, but they're also going to see you being successful and living differently in a way that brings blessings into your lives. And they're going to want to do that too. And I hope that as you remind yourself of how to love the Lord and love the people around you, love the world, that you give them the very best translation of the Bible that there is. We're going to have a hymn of invitation. And if you have not mezuzah'd your